Thank you for joining us at the third event in a series of virtual book club events for our Watershed Moments Statewide Read. Our inaugural statewide book club invites North Carolinians to read selected works of literature so that they can dialogue and connect with one another over important issues in our state and in our communities. As a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Paolo Bacigalupi's novel, The Water Knife. Tonight's discussion of the themes covered in The Water Knife presents an opportunity for us to share our experiences, consider new perspectives, and better understand the role the humanities play in helping us become more informed citizens. It is our pleasure to welcome the host of Charlotte Readers podcast, Mr. Landis Wade, as this evening's moderator. It is also our pleasure to welcome Ms. Jacqui Castle, Dr. John Kessel, and Mr. Klaus Albertin as this evening's featured panelists. North Carolina Humanities Council staff member Caitlin Stanley is also part of this evening's event and will be assisting with questions and answers. Before we turn the event over, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. So if you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab. For polls and other interactive questions, you can respond to the poll or use the chat feature. We encourage you to share your experience on social media with the hashtag Watershed Moments and tagging at NC Humanities. So Caitlin is going to launch a poll to see what topic you are most looking forward to hearing about at tonight's conversation. So take a few minutes and please answer that poll and hit submit, and we'll report out on what everyone is most looking forward to hearing about tonight.
Awesome. We had a lot of results come in on that poll, Melissa, and the clear front runner was water rights, followed by journalism and drought. So definitely a lot of interest in the water rights, and there's a lot to talk about on that front too.
Awesome. That is great. Well, we'll get started without further ado, and I will kick this event off by turning it over to Landis.
So thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to the North Carolina Humanities Council and also to Caitlin for helping us get ready for this and preparing us. I'm Landis Wade. I'm the host of Charlotte Readers podcast. I was a trial lawyer for 35 years. I'm now a recovering trial lawyer, turned author, turned podcaster, and I'm just really pleased to be here tonight. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed and expert panelists to talk about 4 themes this evening. The themes are visions of the apocalypse, is a water apocalypse coming, a drought and future water scenarios, how we cope, water rights, who owns the liquid gold, and journalists and journalism in an apocalyptic world. And our panelists are going to talk about this against the backdrop of this dystopian thriller, The Water Knife, written by national bestselling author Paolo Bacigalupi. But more about that in just a moment. Also, before I introduce the panelists, I'd like everyone who's watching just to think about this for a minute. Think about the last time you're really thirsty. For me, it happened a couple of nights ago. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd had too much salt to drink, I think, and I drank some water. Man, it tasted good. I mean, think about the last time you were hiking, the last time you were out working out. God, the water tasted great. And we sometimes take it for granted. I know I do. What if it was so scarce, we'd be fighting over it? So that's what we're here to talk about. Okay. All right, in alphabetical order, here we go. Here are our panelists. I'm going to introduce each of them in alphabetical order by first name. You can raise your hand. Jacqui Castle, raise your hand there. Jacqui is a freelance writer and novelist. She's been widely published and was selected as the 2020 Indie Author of the Year by the Indie Author Project. Her debut novel, The Seclusion, is a Ford Indies Book of the Year award winner in science fiction and the winner of the North Carolina Author Project. It explores a United States in 2090 that has cut itself off from the rest of the world and has a totalitarian board that considers certain books dangerous contraband. What could go wrong with that? All right, next we got John Kessel. John, raise your hand there. John is an award-winning writer, editor, and professor of English at NC State University. He's the author of the novels Pride and Prometheus, The Moon and the Other, Good News from Outer Space, and Corrupting, let's see if I have this right, Corrupting Dr. Nice. And let's see here. Something jumped up on my screen. I apologize. And he's also written stories that have given him awards from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America Association. And he's had a TV series on one of the stories he's written. And like Jacqui, he knows a thing or two about worlds turned upside down. We also have Klaus Albertin. Klaus, raise your hand there. Klaus is, he's not writing science fiction or end of the world novels, but he is an expert in this natural resource we call water. He's the chair of the North Carolina Drought Management Advisory Council and responsible for supporting statewide water supply planning. He's the point of contact for the Division of Water Resources supporting climate resilience efforts. He's also been a senior technologist specializing in water quality and quantity modeling, has 14 years experience in the areas of development of watershed and water quality models, regional water supply planning, and climate change adaptation. So he's going to answer some of these questions for us from a legal and practical perspective about the water. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to recap the book, and then we're going to get some impressions from our panelists about the book. It's a fascinating book. I'll show it to you. Many of you probably read it. It's The Water Knife. Here we go. In the near future, believe it or not, the Colorado River has dwindled to a trickle. Detective, assassin, and spy Angel Velasquez cuts water, if that can be done, cuts it for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, ensuring that its lush archaeology developments can bloom in Las Vegas. When rumors of a game-changing water source surface in Phoenix, Angel is sent south, hunting for answers that seem to evaporate. I like that. Evaporate as the heat index soars and the landscape becomes more and more oppressive. There he encounters Lucy Monroe. She's a hardened journalist with her own agenda, and Maria Villarosa, a young Texas migrant who dreams of escaping north. As bodies begin to pile up, the three find themselves pawns in a game far bigger and more corrupt than they could have imagined. And when water is more valuable than gold, the alliances shift like sand. And the only truth in the desert is that someone is going to have to bleed if anyone hopes to drink. I love that. Okay, so The Water Knife, it's post-apocalyptic. It's a futuristic story. It's set in the American Southwest. And if you've been out there and seen the Colorado River, it's magnificent. There's only so much water to go around. And in this future, this region, the U.S. is broken up into these sovereign territories, and they're fighting each other over this remaining water supply. So these stories of these three characters, Angel, Lucy, the journalist, Angel, the water knife, Lucy, the journalist, and Maria, she's the migrant from Texas. We'll talk more about that. They intersect around this rumored set of water rights. They're purported to be these senior rights, maybe that belong to some ancient group of people, but we don't know that for sure. But they do hold the key to the Colorado River, and the city of Phoenix is collapsing, barely holding on because they're competing for water. All right, that's kind of the setup. I'm gonna first turn to Jacqui, one of the writers here, of the dystopian, the worlds that are falling apart. Jacqui, give us some of your thoughts, quick thoughts on The Water Knife. Maybe something that caught your attention, made an impression on you, just something about this story to kind of set the stage. You're going to have each of you take a couple of minutes and share some of your thoughts about the book.
Sure. Well, let me first say thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. My first thought when reading the story was that the world that the author painted was pretty near future and could play out within a few decades. So if you become so reliant on one water source, you could see, you know, with the West Coast already having so many droughts back to back, how this could, become a reality, which I think as someone who writes near fiction dystopian, I think that's kind of part of the allure of that specific genre. And I really enjoyed seeing how the author set up his world filled with these safe, lush living quarters for the rich, or the ecologies, as you mentioned, and then also these refugee camps for the displaced. They do focus mostly on state refugees from Texas to Arizona in this story, and you can't help but kind of draw some similarities to our world right now. But what will probably stick with me the most is the depiction of water just as a currency of power, and how quickly that has changed hands throughout the world that the main character describes, and also how quickly it could change hands again. And I thought the author did a really wonderful job of blending different genres. The pacing and the cutthroat writing style kind of reminded me a lot of crime fiction more than standard dystopian. And so that was kind of a fun, entertaining twist, to be immersed in a dystopian world, but have it not necessarily follow all of the rules of the genre.
Yeah, well, that's great. I love that that phrase, currency of power. Water, and in this book, for those of you who've read it, you'll notice that they're standing in line from time to time, long lines, and they're using most of the currency they have just to get a little bit of water to maybe make it through the day. All right, I'm gonna turn to another writer here. John, what are your thoughts on the book?
Well, like Jacqui, I was taken up by the story, and this strikes me as I mean, I've been reading and writing science fiction a long time, and I teach classes in science fiction, and so this book sort of falls into a tradition of what I'd call a dire warning book, and there's sort of two kinds of such books. One is a speculative book where you basically imagine some new thing that has never happened before, like aliens invade from outer space. But the other kind is the more down to earth. It's the extrapolation novel, where you take some trend that's going on in the present and then you just push it forward. So books like that tend to be really, a lot of times they're more about the present than they are about the future, or they're using the future to talk about the present, or to warn the present, or to somehow get people in the present to pay attention to something that is going on already, but they may not have paid any attention to it. So I think that's definitely what Paolo Bacigalupi is doing here, is using this thrilling story and the plight of his characters to raise our on the one hand, just to tell it's like a thriller. It's but on the other hand, to draw us in to the issues that are behind that. So one of the things that struck me about the plot of the book is that everyone seems to, the whole plot turns on this document that everyone wants, and it gives apparently gives permanent water rights to whoever possesses it. And to me, this is like what Alfred Hitchcock called the MacGuffin in his movies, where you have some object that's immensely valuable that everyone wants, that in itself, is sort of powers the entire story. And so in this case, he ties that to his extrapolation of water rights. This MacGuffin is the thing that supposedly gives you perhaps unlimited right to the water that's available there. I thought that was really clever, the way he used a really kind of standard thriller move to make a social comment.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. And as we think about that MacGuffin and that object that they're looking for, this document, and we turn to Klaus, who just took a big drink of water, I noticed, before he was going to speak here. See, if we didn't have water, we couldn't even do these panel discussions here. So, yeah. So turning to Klaus here, and we're talking now about something that's not hidden. This document that John mentioned, it's hidden. They're searching for it. The thing that's not hidden that they can see is flowing down between these caverns in the Colorado River. It's the water. And you, being the water specialist, you're reading this book. What comes to mind for you in this book?
Well, for me, the book was really depressing.
Yeah.
It was hard for me to finish it. I read it back when it first came out, and it was hard then, and it was hard this time around too. I think it really hits close to home for me. I think I see so many of the issues that he talks about: water rights, water scarcity, migration. Basically, all the different issues. There is basis in truth, and the book is dystopian, but it isn't that hard to really see that, kind of play out the way he thinks. I grew up in Arizona, so that's another reason it hits close to home. Kind of my last thought was, the author must really hate Phoenix because, they take the brunt of it.
Yeah, California and Nevada have got Phoenix boxed in, so, and they just thrown Texas off to the side, which, some people might not have a problem with. But anyway, that's what they've done in the book. I'm sorry, I got to go back and forth between glasses here because I wanted to talk about this scarcity thing too. I'll just offer my impression too for the book. One of the things that, like Klaus, I was really reading this book for the thrill of it and the excitement of it, but I was also getting bogged down like he was in the reality of it. And there's a section on page 45 where they're talking about this thing called the CAP. It's the Central Arizona Project Canal in this book, and they call it an IV drip from the Colorado River to Phoenix. And that's the only way that the water is getting there, 300 miles across the desert. And then it talks about you've got these lunatics farther upriver in Colorado and Wyoming and Utah who keep saying they aren't going to send any water down to the lower basin states at all. And then there are people fighting over it. So, just the whole idea that you've got very little water, they're trying to transport it across the desert, they're cutting it out. It's made me think, wow, okay, that's something to talk about, which is why we're having this panel discussion night, which leads us into one of our 4 themes tonight. We're going to go right in here. Thank you all for those great insights about the book, by the way. We're going to start with the theme, Visions of the Apocalypse. So we've already said the backdrop of this book is that we've got a water supply that's no longer assured, the Colorado River. I was actually out one time at the Hoover Dam, and you can walk across it and you can look down, into the basin there, and the water has already dropped way below what should be a water table, and there's discoloration on the rock. It's been happening in the Colorado River for years, but in this book, they're having Category 6 hurricanes. They don't even have them rated that high yet because of all the changing in the climate and the loss of the water and that kind of thing. So for Klaus, when we're talking about these this first theme, Visions of the Apocalypse, we're going to pick up with you. Is the reason that you were depressed, and I hope it isn't, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is the reason that you were depressed is that this drought-ridden apocalyptic world that's described so well by this author in the Water Knife is a realistic possibility for us here?
I think in the Southwest, again, it's not that hard to imagine that could be a future scenario. The Southwest is already looking at a multi-year drought right now. It's definitely not as bad as it's gotten in the Water Knife, but just last year, Las Vegas had 240 consecutive days with no rain. Arizona had half of their normal annual rainfall. So you do see these droughts that really, can affect it. And the Southwest is doing well. It's still fine, but as things progress, as climate change happens, it could go there.
So just staying on this theme a minute, why could it go there? I mean, I know we've got the Colorado River. If you watch it on the TV or something, you can see it just rushing down. It seems like a lot of water, but you've got all these mountains, the ice melt and that kind of thing. Is there not as much snow? Are there just too many people for the amount of water that's available? What's going on?
It's definitely both of those. There are years in the recent past where the snowfall has been much below normal. And so that does play out that in, the following spring, you have less water coming down. And if that happens year after year after year, then suddenly, Lake Powell and Lake Mead that you thought were going to be water for millions of people suddenly are half the volume that they used to be. And as you said, as towns grow, especially as things grow upstream, then, that water gets tighter and tighter. And, it could be at some point that those states don't want to release that. And there is the Colorado River Pact that says, you know, you have to release this much, but politics is politics. And, you know, if something major happens, then you never know.
Yeah, they put dams all along that river, and they've got lakes all the way down, and people, you know, competing for the water in that natural resource. And just sticking with you just a minute before we jump to the writers here, the water knife here, Angel Velasquez, he's one of the protagonists in the story, if you can call a villain a protagonist, and he is a detective and an assassin, and he's infiltrating waterboards. Now, you've been on waterboards, right, Klaus? I mean, yeah. So is that a possibility? I mean, I usually think of a waterboard not so much as people running around with guns on their hips and, you know, cutting out water from the Colorado River and that kind of thing. But can you see a time potentially in the future that the people that are running those waterboards, because of the value of what they're controlling, have such power that there could be these people infiltrating them, taking them over, pinning them one against the other? Because that's what the plot line is a little bit in this book.
Well, it is dystopian, so hopefully things never get to that point. I think for, you know, generations, it's going to be lawyers versus, you know, people with helicopters and guns coming in and taking over. But there, you know, have been lawsuits and legal battles fought for decades. You know, an example is Georgia and Florida fighting over the rivers, and so there is a war, or wars going on over water, just not with guns.
All right. Well, it doesn't sound like you've been on any water boards that are about ready to fight with each other. They're probably dealing more in PowerPoint presentations at this point. But we're going to actually move to the writers to talk about this topic of dystopia, the apocalypse, and everything like that. Now, I looked up apocalypse. You know, I probably should have looked it up in the dictionary. I looked it up on Google, but they get it from Oxford Languages. And they define apocalypse as the complete final destruction of the world as described in the biblical book of Revelation. The bells ringing is supposed to usher in the apocalypse, or an event involving destruction or damage on an awesome or catastrophic scale. Now, and this is for the writers. I'll go to John first here, but when we're talking about an apocalypse that involves something as valuable as a water source, let's talk about what makes the scenario in the book fit that definition of apocalyptic, and why the author does such a good job using, you know, this set of facts to demonstrate that world. It's almost pre-apocalyptic, but still. Questions for you, John.
Well, it seems to me that the apocalypse in this book, and actually in a lot of books, often there's an external impetus to it. Like in this book, you'd say one thing that's causing it is climate change. You know, is behind a lot of the conflict that's going to happen here, because it's not raining as much, there's not as much water. But it seems to me Bacigalupi is really more interested in, or as interested in, how people react to this. Because the worst things in the book, the terrible things that happen in this book, are all done by people. Okay, they're done by people, by political units and economic units and criminal gangs and refugees and all these people who are desperate in this circumstance, where the resource that gives them life is dwindling, and there's not enough to go around. And so I think Bacigalupi is talking about something that often happens with human beings and human societies, where there's a lack of something that everyone needs, and then the structures that would normally in a peacetime work to adjudicate conflicts, say lawyers, say, and laws and governments, break down, or they end up at each other's throats. And so that, to me, is actually the most harrowing part of this book, is how the terrible violence that is committed by people who, at least some of them, I think all of them say actually that they're justified in what they're doing. Even the most evil of them think that they have a good reason for doing it, and so that to me is very scary. And one of the things I also think that's sort of a weird misdirection in the book is that you get so focused on this MacGuffin of the document that will give access to the water, a right to the water, that you sort of forget that underneath this is that it doesn't matter who gets that document in the end. The problem is not going to be solved by having that document, because there's going to be a lot of people who won't have water, and it's a distraction from what is essentially a broken political and environmental situation that is created because of decisions that people have made or avoided making. There's not enough water to support the way these Americans have lived in the past in the Southwest. Maybe there used to be enough, but now there isn't anymore. And that's what leads to everything here. So that piece of paper that they get by the end of the book seems to me to be, if you think that there's a happy ending here, I'm not down with that, okay? That piece of paper will be burned up or thrown away or ignored when people come to fight over the water. It's really a kind of a useless, it might as well be toilet paper. It's just not worth the paper it's printed on, in my opinion anyway.
That's a great point. It does provide a nice tool for the arc of the story and the thriller, that you've got these people that are competing for this and people are dying to try to find it. But you're exactly right. It's not going to solve the problem of what the people are going to do when they need their next drink of water. And another thing I'll just throw in, let's don't give the lawyers too much credit here, because I think they used some lawyers, Catherine Case did, one of the evildoers, to kind of get started and get ahead of everybody by gaining these rights upstream and everything. And that's why they were looking for this mythical piece of paper that would give them senior water rights, because they'd use the lawyers to try to cheat everybody else. So anyway, I'm a recovering trial lawyer. I'm not going to let the lawyers off the hook that easily. Let's turn to Jacqui just a second. Jacqui, I've got a question for you in the same vein here, but it relates to writing these kinds of stories and reading them. You've written, in your book, The Seclusion, about the world years from now. Everything's turned upside down. Why do writers love to imagine and readers love to read these doomsday scenarios in literature?
Well, first I'll say that not every writer does and not every reader does, and that's okay. Right. There are many people who will stay far away from this type of story and who would never have an interest in writing it, and that's all right.
It's not a Hallmark.
Yeah, it is not. It's not a Hallmark story. I think that part of the appeal is that, especially in the world we live in right now, with like the last year that we've all been living through, we all have these doomsday scenarios swirling around our head. And so I think fiction, both writing it and reading it, does provide this safe way to explore some of those fears, both for writers and readers. And John was talking about this earlier, but a mainstay of the genre of even just science fiction is just asking those what if questions and following them to extreme conclusions in the example of dystopian and then apocalyptic literature. And so I think even though apocalyptic literature can be dark, you can kind of see yourself in these characters and you can start to imagine, okay, if I was put in this situation, how would I behave and what decisions would I make? And so it just provides a safe way for us to explore some of those very real fears that we all have. And then also, I think was mentioned before as well, that a lot of this literature is written to provide a mirror up to our society. And so, a writer may see, okay, I could see where this path could lead. And so stories like this are often also kind of a cautionary tale. And so you hope that people take away, at least a little bit of examination of how we're currently living our lives and where we're placing our values. And so in conclusion, I just say that I myself find it incredibly cathartic to write dystopian literature, and some people find it cathartic to read it. And if you don't, that's all right.
That's right. Well, I think it's your comments are well placed, and we're going to talk about holding the mirror up to ourselves as we go through these other 3 themes here today. But before we do, I just want to ask a question. I think it's more kind of rhetorical, but of the writers. It's about the importance of telling truth in fiction and how sometimes you can find more truth in fiction than you can in nonfiction. John, you want to comment on that? You're muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
You're talking about the importance of telling truth in fiction rather than nonfiction?
Well, I'm just talking about the importance of trying to tell truths in fiction.
Right.
And actually using that platform, that engaging platform, to actually bury some themes, that people can resonate with.
Right. Well, I think that as a writer, you want to, well, it's interesting. There's certain kind of fiction you read to simply escape from reality, and you don't want to have too much reality in there. The less reality, the better. Okay. But then there's a fiction that strikes home because it seems familiar, or it has things that seem real in it. And so that's the kind of science fiction that I like the most. So you have to draw on basically, if you write an essay about water rights in Arizona, that can be useful. But I think in fiction, you, as Jacqui said earlier, you embody this in real people who have real problems and that you relate to in some way. And so I think it brings it home in a way that an abstract or logical explanation of something would not bring it home as much emotionally. But it seems to me that it's incumbent upon science fiction to try to get this stuff right, to talk to someone like Klaus or somebody who knows about this, and not to depart too drastically from what's real. Otherwise, you have a kind of a fairy tale.
Yeah, and I'm going to draw on Klaus pretty heavily in the next section on water rights here. Before I do, I want to ask Jacqui one more question in this line. And Jacqui, characters are meant to change in novels. They have an arc, even in the dystopian novels where the world has come to an end. So in addition to being a good story, what are your thoughts on how characters changing can also help readers change?
I think we all read to, feel connection with characters. And I think that's what, the strongest stories are made of. And so if you can, present a character that someone really feels like they're walking in their shoes and they're along for the journey, then I think that if you can give that character an arc that the reader feels like they're connecting with, then I think kind of like I was saying before, it provides them a safe haven for questioning how they would make decisions in such a situation. And I think one of the fun things about dystopian literature is that there are kind of 2 arcs at play. There's the arc of the characters, and then there's the arc of society. And maybe the ending for society's arc is not everything we would hope it could be, but hopefully we're provided with a little resolution. I think the water knife is interesting because a lot of our protagonists were actually kind of anti-heroes. And so they weren't necessarily people that we were incredibly empathetic with. And so that kind of brings another layer to it as well, in that you're reading it and you're not quite sure if you like this person. But you also might see some traits that are reflective of yourself in them. I think a lot of writers try to make sure that our characters are relatable. And even if they're not likable, there's going to be a little bit of piece of them that makes the reader, see their humanity and want to go along with their journey.
Right,
did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you. And listeners, viewers, you've got a chance now live here to answer in our interactive poll. Caitlin's putting some questions up there. What do you think of when you hear the word apocalypse and other things? So you can jump in and give us your thoughts. But we're going to keep talking here. We're going to kind of dive into a topic that I think was at the top of the list when we polled people at the beginning: water rights. So Klaus, you're the man now. We're going to actually get into this and talk water rights. We've got this conflict. We're searching for a paper document that John says even if we find it ain't going to do much, in the face of a gun or a bazooka pointed at you. But still, you got water rights. You got things you're fighting for. Let's talk about water rights for a second. We're here in North Carolina. I was telling you, I think in the preparation when I was in law school, we had this thing called riparian rights. It was a little different than what the kind of rights they have out west. So talk about maybe the difference between water rights that being featured in this novel and water rights on the East Coast here, like in North Carolina.
Sure. So water rights out west, it really does come down to how it's described in the book. There are senior rights and there's junior rights, and basically it's whoever was given that right. It could have been, from the government of Mexico back in the 1600s. It could have been as people moved west and, the U.S. bought it. But whoever has the senior rights has the first right to it. And those are extremely serious. I mean, of the laws or the ownership of things out west, those are, definitely maybe the most important is, kind of along the lines of mineral rights and things like that. But, those water rights, those belong to you for that area. And, there's nothing that can take that place unless somebody comes, like in the book, and shows that they've got even more senior rights. By now, and just like in the book, they're pretty well established, who's got the rights, the senior rights and the junior rights. But sometimes things do come up, and people out west do sell their rights. That's something that happens. Farmers have rights, and if they decide not to farm anymore, they can sell that water right to a city or a water district. Out in the east, it's different. We have riparian rights, like you mentioned, and basically anybody who has property that borders a water body has the right to use that reasonably. And it's how it's stated, reasonably, and there's hard to define what that means. And really, riparian rights work when you have a lot of water. When things start getting scarce, that's when the system starts to break down, because just because you've got water rights or your riparian rights in your property, if somebody comes in 10 miles upstream and puts in a factory that needs 1 million gallons per day, they have the right to use that water, and suddenly your water supply goes down. Or if you have a farm and somebody moves into the adjacent farm, drops a well, and your well suddenly dries up, that's just the way riparian rights work. Just because you were there first doesn't mean you have, the right to it anymore.
Yeah, but you said riparian rights, which means that they have some rights. And I guess the question is, it sounds like the Lawyer Relief Act here with the word reasonable. Is there a lot of litigation that you've seen over the years about how reasonable it is, how much water you can take out? Because you shouldn't be able to dry out the downstream, water source altogether, just because you want to put in a manufacturing plant and draw most of the water out of the river, right?
Yep. Yeah, and so it does come down to litigation. And so there's definitely situations where somebody has come on upstream, diverted water, taken water out to irrigate whatever it is, and the downstream farmer suddenly doesn't have a supply. Problem is you have to litigate it, and that can be a year or two process. And in that time frame, you could be seeing a definite loss to your farm or whatever it is that you do. So it is litigation.
So in this book here, there are a lot of cross-border fights between different states, and I'm just curious about how cross-border fights work in the legal world from your perspective, because you got rivers that don't stop at the border, and you got water that doesn't stop at the border. So in the book, the federal government doesn't really get too involved in what's going on out west, or at least it tries to, but then they can't sort of follow it because they don't have boots on the ground. But out here in the east, how are those resolved when you've got cross-border situations?
In the courts, again, Georgia and Florida have had a long-going court case over, water that flows out of Georgia and into Florida. There have been, one example is, and it's still kind of in the courts, is one state trying to change their state border so that they, their state would actually go a little bit up and include part of another river basin, which means that they would suddenly have the ability to take water out of that. There's fights in North Carolina between river basins. If, a town in one basin wants to take water out of another basin, that ends up going to court every time because it, can be seen by some as taking from one and giving to another, taking from a poor or less developed basin and bringing it to a more developed basin. So it always ends up in the courts.
So before I go to the writers here in this topic, I want to understand, because I read your bio and it had some big words in it that I didn't quite understand that dealt with water rights and that kind of thing. So tell us how the agency that you work with would get involved, if there were disputes that existed, or are you more about water quality with what you do? Talk about what the state could do to deal with some of these issues.
Sure. Well, right now, again, there's nothing that stops somebody from coming in and building a new factory or taking water. But there are permits that they have to get through the state so that they can, actually build that facility and take that water. That currently is really the only way the state can control how much is being taken out. And so the process is now, if somebody wants to either expand their water withdrawal or build a new factory or a new intake for a town or whatever it is, they have to get that permit for the facility. So that is the way the state can kind of control how much is being taken out. So at the moment, we can say, okay, during drought conditions, there's going to be 50,000 feet per second of water flowing through. And this town is taking this much and this factory is taking this much. There's only this much left. That's how it is done now. But it's not too hard to see, in the future or in some sort of legislation that, that process gets kicked out and suddenly there are no controls. And, if there's the right incentive or the right push from legislatures, then, that control goes away from the state and, then whoever's paying for that change can suddenly come in and take that water, and then everybody downstream, gets the short end of it.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, like anything else that's run by the government, there's probably some lobbying that can go into this. And we hadn't even talked about polluting the water yet, which happened with our Cape Fear River here in North Carolina. There's been a big issue with that happened years ago. So with that in mind, we're going to jump to the writers for a minute on this topic of water rights, but we're going to talk more in terms of some of these villains and the decisions they're making around these water rights. There's this character, Catherine Case. She's a corrupt business magnate who controls the Nevada water supplies and the luxury archaeology structures. It sounds far-fetched in one respect, writers, but at the same time, there's a realism to it. And I just want to have us talk just a second about the villains and why it's important that we understand their motives and they understand who they are and why they actually sound like they're not made up out of thin cloth. John, you want to start with that idea?
Yeah, Catherine Case is an interesting character. She's not really on stage that much in the book, but she's in the background. But, I think she would think of herself not as a kind of corrupt business magnate, but as a public servant who is trying to preserve water for the people of Las Vegas and Nevada. And yes, she has connections to wealthy people and they're building these arcologies. The idea of an arcology has been around in science fiction a long time. They're actually not just in science fiction. The idea, it's really a massive enclosed sort of, building, but it's really much bigger. It's like a city or a whole town within one building. And so what they do there is they grow plants in there. They have residences in there. They have shops. It's like, in some ways, it's like a super shopping mall, except it's much more complicated than that, because they try to recycle everything. So that the reason she wants these water rights is so that they can build these arcologies, and they, in some ways, they're actually more ecologically sound in the sense that they don't just throw the water away; they recycle it all the time. And so people have talked about that for a long time, and Bacigalupi here is using that idea of, okay, one of the reactions to the difficulty of getting water is to build these things. But the other side of it is, to me anyway, is the class system, where you have to have money to get into this. And a lot of people don't have the money. And so as we see in our own society, I think that, if you have more resources, you have more money or more income, your quality of life is higher. You live in a nicer house in a nicer neighborhood, and I think that money is the determining factor here for people who are living this much better life. Meanwhile, people like the refugees from Texas, like Maria and her sister, are they're out of luck. They don't have the resources.
Yeah, and Jacqui, sticking with this theme of villains, in novels, some would say that a compelling protagonist is only as good as the compelling villain that they're up against. And we have some villains in this book. John talked about Catherine Case, but we have Angel, who is a villain because he works for her, cutting the water out, doing her dirty work for her. But he's actually turning a little bit as the book goes from one to the other. Talk about the importance on this idea of villains. They're up against these terrible circumstances, so they're trying to get by, and yet they're starting to realize maybe what they're doing is not right, and they start to turn.
Yeah, I think the most compelling villains are not just, oh, here's a big scary bad guy, but here's someone with a backstory who really truly believes that what they are doing is the right thing to do. And usually written in a way where the rest of us see that it's obviously not, but they have their convictions and they truly believe that what they're doing is best. I thought that, Angel was a very interesting character because he, like we said, was kind of an anti-hero, but he also kind of had this, I'm just doing it. It's just a gig. So I just kind of do what they tell me to do. And it wasn't until he started kind of connecting with someone who, maybe an earlier version of him would have just seen fit to eliminate and not make his problem anymore, that he started to kind of question what he was doing and why he was doing it. And then, without giving too much away, there was still kind of the end of the book where it all kind of just came to a head anyway. And so I think they're very interesting characters because they're not only battling their own conscience throughout the story, but they also, all of them have, this fear of like these mob-like corporate forces that they also have to answer to. And so they're all kind of, on the run in some way or another and think their life is on the line. And then they also have this other question of wanting to be on the winning side, for their future selves, seeing that, if they lose this valuable resource, then and they cannot leave the state that they are in, that they will also be out of water, just like the rest of the state. And so there's a lot going on. And he definitely wrote, even the most redeemable of the characters all kind of had a pretty deep, dark side. And so I think that's a fun thing to play with. And I enjoy writing villains very much.
That's good. That's good. Well, we're about to move into the third topic, drought, another happy topic, drought. Before we do, though, Caitlin's going to launch a set of questions in the poll here. I think she's going to have give y'all a little bit of time to respond to that. If I'm right, Caitlin, you tell me, and then we'll, yeah, here we go.
Yes, you should see the poll on your screens now. So please give us your perspective.
And I don't know if I can just add, if that's okay, that it, you know, ethically, it was very interesting to me in the story that these were kind of indigenous rights to the water, but that was almost not mentioned at all. It was still kind of a zero-sum game based on where this physical piece of paper ended up.
Yeah, and the poll is asking, you know, who do you think deserves to claim the water rights in the story? And they start out with Angel to give the rights to Catherine Case. I hear some boos in the background for that one. Lucy, Lucy to give the rights to the city of Phoenix and save it from collapse. That sounds noble. The Callies to cement their dominance of the water game. We're not so much there, I don't think. The Pima, historically, the water rights belong to the tribe. They're a front runner, probably. No one. Water is a natural resource that doesn't belong to anyone. Now, that one would be the right one, maybe. But Klaus, I mean, you've told me that out west, that's not exactly how it works.
Yeah, that's right. You know, there are court cases that do try and allocate a little bit to ecology. I think touching on that last one. So there are considerations that, you know, not just people, but every people and ecology do get some of it.
Here are the results from our poll.
Yeah, it looks like we've got 42% of the people say that the Pima, historically, the water rights belong to the tribe. 58%, no one. Water is a natural resource. It doesn't belong to anyone. Okay, good. So they're going to tell the lawyers where to go out west and solve the problem for us. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead, Klaus.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, there has to be some sort of way to allocate it. And so I agree with, you know, the last answer. But there needs to be some sort of established methodology that does give, you know, some to ecology, some to, you know, different people, be it agriculture, industry, cities, things like that. Just saying it belongs to everybody is kind of ends up with anarchy, is how I'd go.
Okay, well, let's don't have anarchy except in the books. Let's go to theme 3, the drought. In the book Angel, the Water Knife, he's talking about this book Cadillac Desert, which he says Catherine Case makes them read because the way he describes it, my boss makes all our new hires read this. She likes us to see this mess isn't an accident. We were headed straight for hell and didn't do anything about it. All right, from the water side, Klaus, before we get into how the writers think about that comment, how does North Carolina manage its water and plan for drought?
Well, before I answer that, I would say if people haven't picked up Cadillac Desert, it is a very interesting book. And I think even now, you know, I think we are, or the West is heading towards hell and are still kind of ignoring it. How does North Carolina handle things? Kind of getting into the weeds of how the Department of Environmental Quality manages it. Every public water supply is required to develop a local water supply plan and submit that every year. Every 5 years, they have to develop a water shortage response plan, which lays out during different levels of drought what sort of conservation measures, restrictions, what the town is going to do to meet those drought conditions. You know, so if they're in a moderate drought, then they have to do this. You know, you get into extreme drought, then, you know, obviously there's more restrictions, things like that. So the state works with the municipalities to handle their conditions.
Yeah.
Once you get past the public systems, like, you know, town of Cary, city of Charlotte, things like that, it gets a little fuzzy. You know, if you have your own well, then you're kind of on your own. Agriculture kind of can do what they want. So it's really, the state regulates the public water supplies, kind of the short answer, and does a decent job of that.
All right, well, keep up the good work there, Klaus. Make sure do the best you can. Let me turn to the writers just a second. I'll start with Jacqui this time. We're talking about the narratives of the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse and how they help us better understand, our present. We've touched on this a little bit. We're talking about politically, social and class systems, our lifestyles. Talk about how this these kinds of books, when we talk about writing about these events, does actually help us hold that mirror up to ourselves and make us think critically about how we should interact with people who are different from us, how we should respond politically to these kinds of things, and maybe how we should adjust our lifestyles.
That's exactly right. I think that when we read these cautionary tales, then, a large portion of us think, okay, how do we prevent this fictional story from becoming reality? And in this instance, I'm sure that not all readers are going to take something from the story other than just enjoying it for a work of fiction. But if even just a portion of the readership starts to examine, their current water usage, or asks themselves how they can be better conservationists, or even it inspires them to learn about water rights in their area and to get involved somehow, then I'd say that's certainly a win.
Yeah. And John, you mentioned as we were preparing for this, you thought it was interesting. And I bring up a character we hadn't talked too much about, Maria Villarosa. She's a young orphan. She's now a refugee from the collapsed state of Texas. She embodies the poor who have to scavenge and survive in harsh conditions with scarce water supply. I think you said you thought it was interesting that Arizona was not now allowing Texas to immigrate across the border. Expand on that a second.
Yeah, well, I think that the book is doing a little satire in places there, so that when right now we have a big issue about illegal immigrants or immigrants coming from Mexico into the United States, and Texas is one of the places, people coming across the Rio Grande. And so here he's presenting a situation, well, all you Texas people who are worried about all those Mexicans coming in and ruining Texas, well, now you're refugees and you can't get into Arizona, you can't get into Nevada, and it's just turning the tables on what. And not only that, he has a situation where all these Americans are trying to get into Canada, and they can't do it. So I think he has a little fun at the expense of those of us Americans who are worried about refugees and immigrants coming into our country and spoiling it, because in his book, we become the refugees. So on a more sort of fiction writing sense and also a more human sense, the end of the book, someone asked about whether it was satisfying among the questioners. And I think that's a good question, because what he set up there, it seems to me, is he has these three main characters. We spent a lot of time with each of them individually. We spent time with them together too. They've gone, all three of them, through some terrible, terrible times, okay? And almost to the edge of death. And so, but they end up so we identify with them, we care about them, I think, to some degree or not. And, we even have a little love story he creates between Angel and Lucy. And so, we care about these people, but they're at cross purposes at the end. And, who gets to have the document with the water rights is a fight at the end of the book. And it's really, I don't know that it's really resolved in a way that's very satisfactory, because it's not like you have the bad guy and the good guy here. Okay, we've seen lots of terrible bad guys in this book. I mean, really bad people, okay? People torturing people and, burying them in mass graves and stuff like that. But, spoilers. But here we don't really see these people, I think, as any, even Angel, who's done terrible things. It's by this point, I think we feel like maybe he's there's some core of goodness in him. And so, you know, there you are they're on the edge of the river, and they have this document, and they're fighting over who leaves us hanging there.
Yeah, that's great. So one last point before we go to our fourth theme here. I was drawn to this one section of the book where it said, senators back east demanded that Nevada end its militia lawlessness, and Governor Andrews dutifully sent out the Guardies to hunt down the bandits. He paraded theatrical arrests in front of news cameras and lined up defiant citizen defenders in court. And as soon as the cameras went dark, the cuffs came off, and Catherine Case's militias returned to their posts along the river. And it made me think about this idea, and I'll turn this to you, Jacqui, that, you know, that might be brought out sometimes in this type of writing, that we're not always focused on what's not right in front of us. You know, I mean, if we can't see it, feel it, touch it, if it doesn't come into our neighborhood, for example, it can't be real. It can't really be going on. And there's a little bit of that displayed in the book, not only in this scene, but also what Lucy's own family knew or didn't know about what she was going through. Could you speak to that?
Sure. And I think Lucy in the story, so she is kind of diving into these investigative stories, but she's in a world where, you know, everyone is telling her you can only cover the surface. You can only take pictures of the bodies. You can only kind of talk about the larger picture of how they're here. But if you dive any deeper, then someone's going to kill you, basically. And she loves her job. She wants to keep doing her job. And so she doesn't really paint a clear picture of how much danger she is into her family. And I think that she, like, you know, a lot of us and like a lot of protagonists in other books, like she can sometimes think that, oh, this is happening to all these people around me, but it's not going to happen to me. Like, I'm going to be just fine. And then she goes through a very intense, you know, basically torture sequence where she realizes that it's kind of her actions are catching up to her, and that, you know, she should have maybe zoomed out a little bit, and instead of just kind of being tunnel vision and focusing on her next story, maybe like taking in the bigger picture and let her family know that she needed a little bit of help. And so I think that yeah, I think that's something we can all learn from these stories, is to just yeah, look at everything else that is going around with us instead of just taking one foot in front of the other.
That kind of leads well into our discussion theme for journalism. I think Caitlin's going to probably put up another question for the audience that you can answer. We'll have another poll here after this last theme here, journalism and the media. We were talking about Lucy Monroe. She's the award-winning journalist who's disillusioned by what's going on. She's gotten herself entangled in this world. She's trying to report on it. The way they're reporting is a little bit different. It's always hashtags and clickbait stories and other kinds of things. But we're going to talk about, you know, both from the water side and the writer side here, how journalists and individuals who have in positions, you know, they have the capacity to make a change in these areas, report about what's going on to keep citizens informed and the risks they face. You know, there's a lot in the world. Journalists are under siege. I mean, it's a hard enough job to be a journalist in this world in some parts of the country, or when you're covering something, even in the U.S. in a volatile area, without putting yourself at risk. And Lucy certainly put herself at risk in this case. I want to talk first, Klaus, to you. Thoughts about how this works in the water world, so to speak, you know, to make sure the truth gets out, how agencies do it, how they work with journalists to do it. You know, maybe when there's not a riot going on around them or a lot that's happening, you know, how is the word getting out and how should it get out? And then I'm going to turn to the writers to talk about some of these other risks journalists face.
Yeah, actually, this kind of answers a question that Paulette from the audience had, or, you know, her statement is that North Carolina is not that well organized when there's too much water. You know, right now we're in a close to record, or last year was close to record wet year. The 2 years before were also really wet. So, you know, during this kind of time, people don't really care about drought. People don't think about it. It's easy to say, oh, we have tons of water. You know, we can expand, we can use water however we want. It's, I think like you said at the beginning, totally take it for granted. So I think during wet periods or even normal periods, it's a challenge to convince people and the legislature and government to, take it serious, to do things proactively. Once it hits, once we start getting into drought, then I think communication is pretty good. The department puts out press releases if things get really bad. The government has press briefings. We talk with meteorologists. I mean, when things get dry, everybody wants to know. So it's easy to get that information out. And I think, we do a good job between us and the state climate office and the weather service and the news. But again, it's when it's wet that it's easy to forget.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I was going to turn to John here with this question because, John, a minute ago, Jacqui mentioned this idea that the Lucy, the journalist, was reporting all those things and then sort of had to draw back and look at reality here about the dangers that she was facing. And in this world in which we live now, where journalists are being accused who are just trying to do their jobs, trying to get the word out there, the truth out there, they're accused of not telling the truth, fake news this, fake news that. Talk a little bit about, where the world is now with not wanting to believe what hardworking journalists are putting out there. And if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. Actually, there's a quote from the book that I thought was very interesting. That it's from page 31, and Jamie, one of the characters, is mocking the idea of people believing things as if that would make a difference. And he says, this is the direct quote, "This was never about believing. This was about looking and seeing, pure data. You don't believe data, you test data. If I could put my finger on the moment we genuinely messed ourselves up, it was the moment we decided that data was something you could use words like believe or disbelieve around." Bacigalupi wrote this book years ago, but he was talking about the idea that now people don't believe there are facts, that facts are a matter of belief. I don't believe that is true. When he's saying that there are some things that are just facts, okay? And it's not a matter of believing or not believing. And if we live in a kind of a culture where, oh no, it's just a matter of your facts versus my facts, or there are no things that are indisputable, then it makes it really hard to have any public discourse, okay, or to come to any conclusions. So I'm a science fiction writer, so I believe in science, and I think that science, there are absolutely questions in science that are not resolved yet, but there are lots of things we can figure out by data. He talks about testing, and so journalists, I think, are part of this in the sense that to the degree that journalists are trying to find the truth and then put it out there for people to hear and then make decisions on, that they have a big role to play. And if journalists are just discounted as just being political agents or liars, then that really eventually breaks down a whole lot of things. It makes it hard for us to govern ourselves, it seems to me.
Yeah, and you make a very good point about, John, about fact versus belief. I mean, belief is important to our psyche and to the world as a whole as well, too, because sometimes there aren't facts to prove anything, and belief depends on faith and so forth. But when you believe certain things in the face of facts that actually prove otherwise, that becomes an issue. And I know this is not a political show. We're not getting into a civics lesson here, but we had an election recently, and some of the people that were objecting were not doing it based on facts, but because their constituents believed something. Well, believing in something is not the same as having the facts to support what you're doing. So I'll stay away from that and move on. But Jacqui, I want to come to you with this last thought here, because you're a freelance writer. You're out there trying to get word out about different things. Thoughts about the how-to of getting the word out, in a dystopian world. I mean, I just think that's interesting because Lucy was facing lots of challenges in doing that. What are your thoughts about, how that can get done in a futuristic world where, we don't have the presses running like we do now?
Yeah, I actually do have a background in journalism. I've done some local journalism here in Asheville for about 6 to 7 years, and now I mostly do fiction writing. But I think that, as long as you keep the mainstay of quality journalism as providing people with reliable, up-to-date information so that they can make informed decisions, and I think you stick to that, and that value is at the forefront, then that is how you move forward. And in Lucy's case, she did kind of they make a kind of a joke, and it's a little satire in the book about her using social media and using these kitschy hashtags. But we're also in a world where it seems like a lot of the broadcast media is only reaching people inside these arcology units. So they mention Lucy having won a Pulitzer. They mention, we see a few broadcast media segments throughout the story where they're reporting on different things that are happening, but you don't really get the idea that the general populace has access to that kind of journalism. And so her using these hashtags and reaching them however she can is really the only tool at her disposal. And so I think that that she's probably doing exactly the only thing she can do at that time. And then also, she keeps trying to dig through those stories the best that she can and uncover, all the evidence that she can, while also keeping herself safe, which in this world catches up to her a bit.
That sounds good. All right. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. We've got an interactive poll here, I think, that Caitlin has, and we've also got a chance for some Q&A for the next 15 minutes. Caitlin, you want to show them the poll?
Yeah, so you guys should see a poll on your screens now. So feel free to jump in and let us know how you feel when you look at media and read these things. How do you think about it? And then we'll transition to the Q&A. So thank you guys so much for putting your questions in throughout the evening. We'll try and get through as many as we can. We did have a lot of really great questions come in. So see if we can get those over to our panelists and hear from them.
All right, it looks like the poll is asking, as an individual, when I consume media, television, print, social media, movies, music, internet, books, billboards, I most think about, and then it's got several choices: who created the media, techniques used to grab my attention, how different people might interpret, why is this message being sent to me, the values and points of view being represented. More than one of these, none of these. Good questions. And I'm sure we're going to have some answers in just a moment, so hang tight.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and share out what we're hearing. Then we'll move into our questions.
Okay, 70% said more than one of these. That's like that that last one you get on a multiple choice. You're really glad it's there. You can say all of the above, but it looks like the next one, the values and points of view being represented, 30%. Okay, so that's interesting that we're not necessarily depending upon what news source is providing it to us. All right, so Caitlin, are you is someone going to throw some questions out to the panel that you sort of assembled here from the audience?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and read them out and let you guys, you kind of direct that conversation, Landis. So our first one is really asking the opinion of our panelists on if you thought the ending of the book was satisfying, and ask kind of is the right thing really the wrong thing for the characters here?
Okay, that's a good question. I think John kind of talked about that a little bit, so I'm going to turn to Jacqui first and then Klaus to see what they thought about the ending. So Jacqui, your thoughts? I think John's already expressed that he didn't find it satisfying one way or the other because there was still a problem that needed to be solved, and there's not enough water out there for everybody, no matter who's got the rights. Your thoughts, Jacqui?
Very similar. I wasn't very satisfied with the ending. The thing that kept popping in my head is, okay, you physically have this piece of paper, but when you deliver that somewhere, aren't people going to read this piece of paper? And, how is what's written on this paper going to factor into that. And none of that seemed to really be going through the characters' heads at the end of the book. It was kind of a zero-sum game, where whoever was in possession was very obviously going to get those water rights. And then, obviously kept gnawing at me that these rights belong to indigenous people in this area. And that was just totally missing from the rest of that story.
Yeah. How about you, Klaus?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I didn't even kind of pick up on it. Like Jacqui was saying, I didn't pick up much that, these were the Pima Indians' water rights in a way. I mean, it stated it, but, I think once they had kind of given them away or sold them off, then they're out of the picture. I guess having grown up out west, I do disagree a little bit about that paper being important. Basically, if you can show that you have that water right, then that trumps everything that, all the other users that have been using that water up to that point.
But if the paper doesn't state the water is yours, even if you're just physically holding the paper, I guess that was what I meant.
I read it that basically the water had been given to the Pimas in some way that was being transferred to Phoenix. I guess one question is, if Las Vegas, if somebody from Vegas had that in their hand, why wouldn't they just burn it immediately and then that record is gone?
Well, it does set up a good chance for a sequel, doesn't it? Right? So,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And John, since you already addressed that, I'm going to let Caitlin give us another question. I'm going to let you go first for the next question.
Yeah, so, okay, we got a great one about more of the literary perspective on what makes a story science fiction versus just regular fiction. So talking a little bit more about these kind of subgenres here.
Well, I don't think the border is like a brick wall. I think that there are stories that fade to one side or the other. The distinction I tend to make more is between science fiction and fantasy. To me, a fantasy story has things that happen in it they're just not possible. Magic, dragons, and wizards and things like that. Whereas a science fiction story, at least originally, it was based on some possibility that is based on the real world, on real science, or takes place within a rationale that would be recognizable to science. So, for instance, you could send a spaceship to the moon. I mean, that is physically possible. You can engineer such a vehicle and do that. And there are lots of science fiction stories that try to accurately represent what it would be like to go to the moon. But then there's a spectrum here. So there's a lot of science fiction. I mean, you go to something like Star Wars, okay? Star Wars is nominally science fiction, but there's a lot of things that happen in there that might as well be magic. And, the Force, for instance, okay? So, in other words, the definition of science fiction, frankly, has been argued about for about 80 or 90 years, and it probably won't be settled anytime soon. But the general feeling I get is that science fiction has to have some connection to the real world. One of my writer friends, Kim Stanley Robinson, says that in a science fiction story, the way that things are in the story, even if it's vastly different from the way we live now, is connected to now by some course of events or history. It's not, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It has some sequence of logical events, some rational actions or developments that occurred that led to the situation as it exists in the story.
That's great. Caitlin, you got another one for us?
I do. I think this one's a little maybe more towards Klaus and trying to understand water rights. But this person wants to know more about the dispute between Florida and Georgia over water. And could North Carolina be in a similar situation? They also there's a question wanting to know more about how riparian rights, if they apply to underground water, or is it only above ground water?
So the Georgia-Florida dispute has been going on, and I want to say it's actually back in the Supreme Court. But basically, the contention by Florida is that Georgia is using too much of the Apalachicola River. The headwaters are up in northern Georgia. It flows through Atlanta, so you can imagine that the demands on that are, pretty significant. And then as it flows through Georgia, other cities, agriculture use it, and Florida says that they're not getting enough. And so this is kind of that situation where most of the river goes through Georgia. They've got riparian rights. So the only way for Florida to argue against it is to say, they're not making reasonable use of the water. And that's a hard argument to, make, or it's easy to fight over it in court. It's hard to solve. As far as groundwater goes, it definitely applies to groundwater. Like I'd mentioned, if you have a farm or a house with a well and somebody moves in next to you and drops a new well and starts pumping as much as they can and your well dries up, that's too bad. You either have to drop a deeper well or you can take them to court and try and get them to reduce it. Really, the only place in North Carolina that has a water permit is 15 counties out in the central coastal plain, where the state did implement what's called a capacity use area. And it does say how much different users can take out of the groundwater, just because the water table had been dropping across that 15 county area so much that it really was impacting everybody. So again, the riparian rights do apply to groundwater and surface water.
Sounds like we're just trying to give the lawyers more business here. Caitlin, you got another question for us?
Yeah, I think this one gets a little more into kind of the motivations of people and how this book could explore that. But they wanted to know why people, might not move when water is scarce, or how they would react to this kind of a drought taking over such a wide geographic area.
So could you run that by me one more time? I want to make sure.
Wanting to understand, or explore the motivations of why some people might live in a place where water is scarce, or why they may not leave and try and go east, or some of them did try and leave, right? They weren't necessarily allowed, but how to explore that idea of freedom of movement, especially in a disaster scenario.
Yeah, and I suppose we're all sort of opining about this from sort of our experiences, but Jacqui, you hadn't spoken in a while, so I'm going to let you jump in here on this topic. I think it's partly a question about people that are in certain areas who really can't afford to move, and they're stuck, and then why some people might want to stay in certain areas and sort of have their blinders on as to what's going on around them.
So the question was, why don't people move to where there's more water in this situation?
Yeah, as I understand it, it would be, so you got people that might live out west. They're sort of there because they grew up there. They're there because they can't move, and they're in a limited water capacity. But then there are others who are there who might have the ability to do something about it, or might have the ability to move, and yet they stay and maybe don't have their eyes on the problem.
Right. Well, I would say that class probably comes into play a lot with this as well, and that many of the people who probably could get out or get into one of those ecology units or go somewhere else safely had probably already done so by the time a story like this materialized. And so then you have people who physically do not have the means to move, or maybe they weren't being told that the problem was as severe as it was, which happens a lot in situations like this and in books like this, is that the general populace does not really realize how close everything is to crumbling until there's not anything that they can do about it. If John may have some other takes as well.
Oh, as a practical matter, I think probably, think about it, when there's a drought. There was a drought here in North Carolina, it must have been 10, 12 yeyears ago, for about a year and a half. It didn't hardly rain at all. People put rain barrels out by their house. I did that. And, people didn't immediately pull up stakes and move somewhere else, okay? And I think that probably what happens is, they think, oh, well, it didn't rain. It hasn't rained for a while, but it's going to rain. Okay, it's we've never had a drought that's lasted this long, so it's going to start raining any day now. Or, you know, this is just a bad year, or 2 bad years, or 3 bad years, but we're going to have a good year. That it stands to reason. But when you have climate change, things aren't, you know, what you're expecting from the past isn't necessarily what you're going to get in the future. And I think that it takes a while before people realize that, and it's borne home to them that they may have to change.
Oh, well, Caitlin, I know we're getting close to 8 o'clock. Do we want to wrap it up, or you have more questions, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to go ahead and move to our closeout, and Melissa will do a little concluding remarks. But, you know, I know we couldn't get to everyone's question, but I think we had some great discussion and got to hear a lot from our panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you so much to Landis for moderating this conversation, and to Jacqui and John and Klaus for sharing their perspectives in this conversation, and to our audience for attending and engaging and asking all those amazing questions. At the conclusion of this event, you will receive an email with a brief survey to complete. So we would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. And our next Zoom event will be a virtual small group book discussion on The Water Knife. So we will be breaking out into small groups, and those groups will be led by book discussion leaders, and you'll have a chance to dive into some of the questions a little bit more, even deeper than we got here. And that will be on February 16th, 2021. You can visit our website at www.nchumanities.org. To learn how to register for that. And we want to thank again everyone for attending and wish you all a good evening. Thanks.